Hello, and welcome to another episode of South Asia Chat, brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. I'm your host, Ramita Iyer, Research Analyst at the Institute. On 24th February, Russian President Vladimir Putin announced a special military operation in Ukraine. The invasion is the first of its kind in a long time. It is the first time a major power has openly defied the norm of national sovereignty and territorial integrity in Europe in the last 80 years. The ongoing war has resulted in a catastrophic humanitarian crisis with several hundreds, if not thousands, of deaths and more than 1.5 million people already having fled the country. 2 weeks since the war began, Ukraine's resistance has complicated Russia's efforts to take control of the capital and overturn the democratically elected government. The invasion comes at a time when the world is already dealing with the effects of the COVID 19 pandemic, global economic instability, and a growing and increasingly assertive China. Given this, the consequences of the invasion for global and regional geopolitics don't look promising. To discuss the Russian invasion of Ukraine and what it means for the South Asian subcontinent, I have with me today Mr. Michael Kugelman, Asia Program Deputy Director and Senior Associate for South Asia at the Wilson Center in Washington. Michael, welcome to South Asia Chat.
Thank you. Great to be here with you.
To start off, can you tell our listeners about Russia's motivations behind the invasion? So, land wars were supposed to be a thing of the past, but what we've seen in the last 2 weeks is perhaps the largest conventional military attack since the Second World War. So, does Russia view the Ukraine invasion as part of a calibrated strategy to undermine the current liberal order, or is this just some kind of crude bid to restore the past glories of the Russian Empire?
Right. The only person that could conclusively answer that question is Vladimir Putin himself, right? He's notoriously famous for being inscrutable. No one knows exactly what's going on in his head. My sense, though, given that caveat, is that this invasion really constitutes a form of unfinished business for President Putin, unfortunately. I think that this is really, for him, a way to finish the job of what happened in 2014, when, of course, the Crimea was annexed. And President Putin has always seen Ukraine as a part of Russia. President Putin also believes that the fall of the Soviet Union was a tactical error and that it should not have happened and that it should be reversed in part. So I think for him, one of the best ways to do that is to recover, so to speak, the area, the country that he believes, above all others, is a part of Russia. And I think that this sort of raises the question of, well, if he's thought that all along, why are we only seeing this invasion now? It's hard to say for sure, but I do think one could look at what had happened in the U.S. over the last few years, in that we had a president until recently, Donald Trump, who many had thought may actually pull the U.S. out of NATO. And so perhaps President Putin wanted to wait and see if that would actually happen before he decided to make a move in Ukraine. Because, of course, among other things, President Putin um, is very concerned about the idea of Ukraine joining NATO. And so, of course, President Trump did not make that move. And of course, President Trump was voted out of power. President Biden came to power. And the Democratic Party has always taken a more confrontational position toward Russia because of this view of the Democrats that that the Russians were involved in meddling in the 2016 elections, which of course resulted in Hillary Clinton not winning. And so perhaps President Putin saw an opportunity there that he wanted to exploit, and that could be why we're seeing this invasion play out now. But bottom line, yes, President Putin is someone that sees Ukraine in ways that many others, including Russia, do not. He's appealed to these very questionable historical grievances to justify this terrible, terrible invasion in Ukraine.
So, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has also seen a global response like never before. The United States, along with its allies in Europe, have imposed very tough financial sanctions on Moscow. Over the past week, we've also seen several other countries around the world follow suit. What do you make of these developments, and what will be the implications of the sanctions on South Asian economies? In a recent article that you wrote, you mentioned that the conflict may also provide some economic opportunities for smaller South Asian countries. So, can you please throw some light on that as well?
Right. Well, I mean, the heavy sanctions slapped on Russia are not at all surprising, not just because of the scale of the invasion and what that would entail in terms of punitive measures, but also because the U.S. and the West recognize that they don't really have many military options. No one wants a third world war, and so NATO is not contemplating sending boots on the ground in Ukraine. So that means that the options, other options, non-military options, aside from sending military equipment into Ukraine, they're relatively limited. So I think that's why we're seeing this perhaps unprecedented type of sanction regime on Russia here. And indeed, it's still unclear how that sanction regime will play out. I think one of the big questions is to what extent will the energy sector in Russia be sanctioned? That's so important, so critical, and also one that's very important for so many of the European countries who are much more dependent on Russian energy exports than the United States is, and it's much more difficult for European countries to accept that a full-fledged sanctions regime on Russia that even targets the energy sector. But I think that the impact is quite notable. We're already starting to see it in terms of the impact on energy prices around the world. In terms of what it means for South Asia, it's very interesting, and it depends on the country. I think that certainly for a country like Pakistan, which only in recent years and really in recent months has been trying to scale up relations with Russia, and when Prime Minister Imran Khan made his awkwardly timed visit to Moscow in recent days, one of the main reasons for that visit was to pursue commercial deals, trade agreements with the Russians, including one involving energy. But now it's unclear to what extent those types of commercial agreements can go forward between Pakistan and Russia because of the sanctions regime. With India, I know that we'll talk about India later. I think really there, the big question is what the impact of the sanctions on Russia will mean for future Indian arms imports from Russia. Russia is, of course, India's main arms supplier, even though India has reduced its share of arms imports from Russia in recent years. And in terms of the impact of the sanctions on Russia on the rest of South Asia, indeed, there are some potential opportunities for some of the smaller states of South Asia, particularly looking at countries like Bangladesh and Sri Lanka and Nepal. These are countries that do have some degree of a commercial relationship with Russia, a modest one. Russia doesn't have much of a footprint in South Asia, but Russia has invested in nuclear power in Bangladesh. It's a key destination for Sri Lankan tea exports. There's also been a lot of Russian interest in the energy industry in Nepal. So I think that with Russia facing sanctions, with Russia becoming a pariah state, it's going to be looking for new markets and new partners well beyond Europe. And I think that South Asia, some of these South Asian countries could be attractive just because these are countries that don't have a hostile relationship with Russia. Several of them have fairly friendly relations with Russia. And I think one could also argue that so many of these South Asian states have been caught up in this intensifying competition for influence between India and China. And some of these countries may see an opportunity to look at a third power, so to speak, to work with. But even though it's an opportunity, I think at the same time, so many of these players in South Asia will be very cautious and hesitant because they have important relations with Europe and with the United States. They would not want to risk jeopardizing trade relations with Europe, including preferential trade privileges, by opening up more with trade with Russia. So I think that even though there may be opportunities, economic investment opportunities, trade opportunities for some of these smaller South Asian states, I think that they'll be very hesitant and cautious before agreeing to capitalize on them.
Apart from the economic response of countries through sanctions, we also saw in a special emergency meeting convened by the United Nations General Assembly in late February, where 141 countries supported the resolution that affirmed Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity. The overwhelming majority in support of the resolution, which condemned the Russian aggression, revealed a collective diplomatic hostility and isolation of Russia. The South Asian response to the resolution, though, was equally divided. We had four countries, Afghanistan, Bhutan, the Maldives, and Nepal, support the resolution, while the other four, Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka, abstained from voting. Have you observed any interesting patterns regarding the positions that these countries are taking? What are their motivations, and what could such a pattern suggest?
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right that there is a divided response from South Asia countries on the UNGA resolution in a literal sense, and that exactly half of the SAARC countries abstained from that vote, which is quite notable, as you suggest. I think that what it reflects is that every country, including South Asia, votes on these types of measures according to their own national interest, and they're not going to necessarily vote a certain way just because the world superpower wants them to. Even when it comes to one of the most egregious aggressions that we've seen in the world since the end of the Cold War, and indeed maybe since World War II. I think that if you look at Bangladesh, it's a very interesting case. Bangladesh has had a fairly friendly, and I would describe perhaps even a nostalgic relationship with Russia over the years, just because of how the position that the Soviets took in the 1971 independence war. That's something that in Bangladesh is still remembered and has, I think, contributed to a situation where many in Bangladesh look at Russia with some fondness. And as I had said before, Russia has been a modest but notable investor in Bangladesh, particularly through nuclear power. So there, I think that Bangladesh simply wanted to keep its options open. It didn't want to jeopardize relations with Russia, in that it did not want to jeopardize future trade commercial links with Russia. It just wanted to maintain flexibility and space, which sounds familiar, of course, if you think about India's own foreign policy goals. With Pakistan, I think it's an issue of timing. As I had said before, in recent months, really over the last few years, Pakistan has sought to grow out its relations with Russia. And I think that given Pakistan's stated foreign policy goal of quote unquote shifting from geopolitics to geoeconomics, it's looking to be a part of more connectivity and trade, connectivity and infrastructure projects stretching from Pakistan into Afghanistan and into Central Asia, and it views Russia as playing a key role in that story, particularly because of Russia's major influence in Central Asia. So I think Pakistan perhaps didn't want to rock the boat with Russia. And I think with Sri Lanka, I guess you'd look at a similar case to Bangladesh. It has some notable trade relations with Russia, and it wanted to maintain flexibility and space to explore more of those relations if it wants to, um, even despite the potential constraint posed by the sanctions regime on Russia.
So, I want to focus a bit more on India's abstention, which has received quite a bit of criticism, especially from the Western policy community. It has sparked speculations on New Delhi's commitment towards a rules based world order, with the Indian Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar announcing just some years ago that India wants to be a leading power, not just a balancing power, the country's silence over the issue seems quite counterintuitive to this image. So, my question here is twofold. Firstly, do you think that India's abstention stems from its long standing nature of pursuing tightrope diplomacy, or is it guided more by strategic considerations? Like you mentioned, a majority of Indian defense equipment comes from Russia. And secondly, given India's silence over the issue, do you see this decision affecting its relations with the West, which is quite critical to maintaining a favorable balance of power in Asia? So, for instance, if you look at the Quad, which comprises the United States, India, Japan, and Australia, India is the only country that has not imposed any kind of sanctions on Russia so far. How do you think India should manage its relations with Russia and the West?
Yeah, it's a great question, and so much to unpack here. I would push back against those observers that say that India has been silent. I don't think it's been silent. Each time it's abstained from a UN resolution on the invasion, the its permanent rep to the UN has posted justifications for that decision. They've been publicly posted, and each time there's been reference to the need to respect territory and sovereignty per the UN's main principles. That's something right there. There have been a series of calls between Putin and Modi, um, and that's significant. But indeed, it is striking that India has not been willing to take more of a bold stand. I don't think it's surprising, and I think that the listeners to this discussion, and really many that look at the Indian relationship with Russia over the years, would not be surprised at all, given that this is a consistent position that India has taken at the UN. It does not vote against Russia. It does not vote to criticize or condemn Russia when it engages in aggressions. And this goes back to the Soviet days as well. And of course, the most recent case being the annexation of Crimea, when India was similarly unwilling to criticize Russia for that. But indeed, I think that this is a position that's increasingly untenable for India for several reasons. One is that its relationship with the U.S., particularly its security relationship with the U.S., has grown so much even since 2014. So there's more pressure on India to take a harder line, and that pressure comes from other NATO countries as well. And also, this is indeed, I mean, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a particularly egregious aggression. Not to underplay the egregiousness of the Crimea annexation, but this we're talking about, an invasion of one of the largest countries in Europe, and so I think that India has indeed been trying to continue to sit on the fence, but I think there's a risk that that fence could start to collapse soon. So, what does this mean for India? Can it do? What should it do? I think that it's unrealistic to expect India to change course and suddenly, condemn Russia and call it and you intentionally use all the type of language and rhetoric that you're hearing from the U.S. and other Western countries. That's not realistic. But I do think that it's very realistic for India to try to play a type of mediator role, which I know doesn't necessarily come natural to India in these contexts. But we've seen there are relatively few countries that have the leverage and the influence with Russia because of friendship with Russia to be able to actually engage with Putin and try to deliver a message, even if it's delivered privately, to really focus on de-escalating and the importance of doing so. We've seen the Israeli prime minister in Moscow in recent days. The Turkish leader was there. I'm sure there'll be others as well. I don't see why Prime Minister Modi could not play that type of role either, which is very separate from starting to vote to condemn the Russian invasion at the UN and harshly criticizing Putin. Doesn't need to come to that. I think that quiet diplomacy, quiet mediation is certainly something that can be very practical and very realistic. Let's face it, this war in Ukraine, particularly if it continues to play out, could impact Indian interests very deleteriously for a number of reasons. One, it could distract the U.S. And other like-minded countries from focusing on the Indo-Pacific policy, which is meant to counter China, which of course is something that India certainly agrees with. This war could drive Russia closer to China. It could strengthen Russia-China relations, going beyond what to this point is largely an economic partnership. That would not be good for India, which has long seen Russia as a balancing effect, a country that it wants to balance out Chinese power. So India clearly has an interest in doing everything it can to get Russia to pull back, and it has options, as I've noted, short of just condemning Russia. Now, the impacts of India's position, if it continues to stay subdued and doesn't really do much to try to rein in the crisis, I think the relationship with the U.S. will be okay. There's so much insulation in the U.S.-India relationship that could withstand shocks, such as the current one involving Russia. This is a relationship that has been developing, strengthening exponentially since the early 90s, and particularly since the early 2000s. There's a lot of trust and goodwill, a lot of regular high-level dialogues. There's no issue there. And also, most importantly, China is the issue, the factor that is really the glue that drives the U.S.-India relationship, shared concern about China's rising power. And if we agree that the war in Ukraine will make China even stronger, particularly if it means Russia becomes dependent on China, particularly for economic support, thereby giving China more leverage, that will make China stronger, thereby amplifying the threat posed by China to U.S. and Indian interests. So I think that the U.S.-Indian relationship will be fine because the key driver of that relationship will only become more apparent with this war. But the question is what happens down the road when it comes to the future of Indian arms imports from Russia. The jury's still out on what the U.S. decision will be on CATSA. If, in other words, if it would actually be willing to sanction India for its acquisition of the S-400 Russian missile defense system. The conventional wisdom has been that India will receive a waiver from the United States and will not be sanctioned. I still think that's the case. The main reason why the U.S. would be willing to give India an exemption still applies, even with India's position on the war in Ukraine. And that is that, on the whole, India has in fact reduced its arms imports from Russia in recent years. So I think that won't be impacted. I imagine the waiver will still come, but I think we can expect the Biden administration to come down much harder on India about the need to scale back, if not entirely halt, any future arms imports from Russia. And how India responds to that, I think, will go a long way in figuring out what impact this war could have on U.S. India relations down the road. India is not in a position to completely halt its future arms imports from Russia. It may have reduced its share of imports from Russia, but it's still dependent on Russia for about 65-70% of its arms imports. Russia's indigenous defense production is not there yet. It's not in a position to replace uh, the arms that it's been able to get from Russia. And even with the fact that India has been able to diversify its sources of arms imports in recent years, not just the U.S. but also, of course, France and Israel, among others. But it still looks to Russia as a key supplier, particularly for specific types of equipment that it doesn't get from anyone else. And we did see India give in to U.S. pressure, and it reduced its energy imports from Iran significantly when the U.S. sanctioned Iran some years ago. But it's very different with the case of Russia and arms imports, because when it came to energy in Iran, India had ready alternatives. It was able to capitalize on what had been strengthening relations with the Saudis and other countries in the Gulf, where there were easily alternatives to Iranian energy. But it's different with Russia. Final point on this, the impact on the Quad here. I also would not overstate the impact that India's position on this crisis could have on its relations within the Quad. The Quad continues to be focused on things other than Russia, i.e., countering China. But what I will say here is that this war in Ukraine, I think, at the very least, will amplify the awkward differences between India and the other Quad countries on the issue of Russia and the position taken toward. Also, if Russia does indeed get closer to China, and if China pressures Russia to expand its presence in the Indo-Pacific, then I think that makes it even more difficult for the issue of Russia to be overlooked or avoided within the Quad. And it is notable that when you had this virtual Quad leaders meeting the other day, Japan, Australia, and the U.S., their readouts all pitched this as a discussion about Russia's aggressions in Ukraine. And I believe the Japanese Prime Minister readout even indicated that, this is a threat to the rules-based order, which is pretty significant because that's what the Quad is all about. So I think that the Quad will be fine, but it's going to be very difficult to avoid the Russia issue, which in turn will, at the very least, amplify this awkward reality that India takes such a different position from the other Quad countries.
Finally, delving a bit deeper into the question of China, going by recent events, the growing US China rivalry, and the deepening of bilateral relations between China and Russia, there seems to be a growing Sino Russian axis. With seemingly two revisionist powers in Eurasia, what does this mean for the strategic choices of countries in South Asia? And also looking at it from the Chinese perspective, given that the global response towards the Russian invasion has been so harsh in terms of the sanctions, do you potentially see a change in China's calculations towards its growing relationship with Moscow? And how do you see this affecting the larger global balance of power?
Yeah, so we've discussed this important question of China-Russia relations and how it'll be impacted by the war. And I think that it's important to look at this with some nuance because many, including myself, just now, have sort of put out this idea that it's quite likely that the war will strengthen China-Russia relations because Russia, being a sanctioned pariah state, will have no choice but to throw itself at China and ask for financial support, which would give China a lot of leverage and could put China in a position where it could pressure Russia to do a lot of things that could impact India deleteriously, such as reducing its arms supplies to India and so on. But I think several points to be made here. First, China does not necessarily benefit from a prolonged war for several reasons. One, uh, the the idea that China would want to be seen as the ward of the Russian state, the idea that Russia or that China would be happy to sort of take on Russia as a country that would have to help, that I think that could be a bit concerning for Beijing. I mean, China is already seen as that country that sort of looks after North Korea, and has to sort of help this pariah state and providing economic support to appease it and so on. I don't think China necessarily likes having to do that, and it could be a similar case with Russia. China may prefer that it not have to be dealing with a country so heavily dependent on it. So that's one factor. The other one is that the war, I think, is problematic for China because China is such obviously a critical global economic player. It has so many supply chains out there. Its Belt and Road Initiative means that it's literally present just about everywhere. And so it doesn't want to see prolonged instability and conflict. And particularly, in Europe, it just does not want to see that. That impacts its operations, or could impact its operations, and it does not want to see that. So that's what I would say about that. So it's very difficult to know really what will happen to the China relationship moving forward. But indeed, clearly there is a growing partnership here. And I think that Pakistan also plays into this as well. I mean, we know that Pakistan is a longstanding ally of China, and it has been trying to deepen its relationship with Russia. So I think that if you sort of consider that triad, that trifecta there, I think that has pretty significant implications for India, for sure. But what that means for the South Asian states more broadly is unclear. I think if we look at a country we haven't discussed yet, I think Afghanistan. Well, for quite some time there had been hopes in Islamabad that Pakistan could work with China and with Russia to develop infrastructure projects and other investments in Afghanistan leading into Central Asia. That can't happen unless all three of those countries are satisfied about the security situation in Afghanistan. But even the possibility of that happening, I think, is posed some concerns for India, which has already been locked out, or not locked out, but it faces new challenges in Afghanistan now that the Taliban is in power. And if it were to if it's two rivals, Pakistan and China, along with its friend Russia, were operating in Afghanistan in lockstep, I think that could make it more difficult for India to figure out ways to become more engaged in that country, for sure. But in terms of the other South Asian states, I think that, as I had said before, it wouldn't impact them nearly as much. And I think that to the extent that the South Asian countries would want to continue to engage with Russia, they could certainly do that on bilateral levels through trade and investment. But again, only if they are comfortable doing that, given the risk of running afoul of the sanctions regime, of the Western sanctions regime, which certainly would not serve their interests, given how important they see their trade relations with Europe and the US, and in the case of Bangladesh, a country that already has been sanctioned by the US because of the human rights abuses of one of its major security institutions. They'll need to be very careful and very cautious as well. So I think that really it's India that would be most concerned and potentially disadvantaged by this growing China Russia relationship, and particularly if you throw Pakistan in there as well. Final point, going back to what I had said before, India would much rather see more space between Russia and China so that Russia can be more of a balancer to balance out Chinese power. And that plays in with India's longstanding preferences for a world order where there is some degree of multipolarity. There isn't too much of it now, but Russia, for India, can sort of advance the idea of a more multipolar world by having a key power separate from China, separate from the United States. But if Russia's relationship with China continues to grow, obviously that undermines multipolarity in that you've got two major powers working together instead of separately, and that's something that would be problematic for India's interests, for its foreign policy interests.
Well, I really wish we had more time because there are several other aspects to unpack here as well. But thank you so much, Michael, for joining us today and sharing your insights.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You were listening to South Asia Chat. To learn more about our work, visit us at isas.nus.edu.sg. You can also get updates on our latest publications, events, and podcasts through social media. We're on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram.